And I would argue that there is no more East Jerusalem. And this is key to the two-state solution, that East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. There is no more East Jerusalem. And 3 times he applied, each time costing him $5,000. So Israel makes the whole process of applying unaffordable to the vast majority of Palestinians.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 25 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. In June, Jeff Halper of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions spoke in Connecticut. We'll have part of his presentation on the program today. In the sections we'll show, he explains the fatal flaws in the peace plan endlessly dangled by the U.S. government, the so-called two-state solution. And he'll talk about the importance of house demolitions in the Israeli occupation, and the case of one particular victim, the Shawamra family.
On the one hand, it's a global conflict that's disrupting the entire international system and certainly compromising the United States' position in the world. On the other hand, it's a conflict that has a solution, or at least it's had a solution all these years. Beginning in 1967, immediately upon the occupation after the Six-Day War, the international community agreed upon what's called the two-state solution. So this is a map of what's called the two-state solution. And the concept is simple. There is one country. It's one country. The Jews call it the land of Israel, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. The Palestinians call it Palestine. Religious people call it the Holy Land. Whatever you call it, it's one integral country, and all these internal divisions are new and artificial and really don't mean much. And in this one country, whether it should be like this or not, there are two peoples living today. The Israeli Jewish population and the Palestinian Arab population. There's two peoples, and the idea of the two-state solution was what actually the Israeli peace camp has said for many years. 2 states for 2 peoples. Now, if you look at the map, it's not exactly a fair and just solution. It's not dividing 50-50, because in fact, in this country today, half the population is Palestinian. Now, that doesn't include about 4.5, 5 million or more Palestinian refugees that live around the country. So that even if some of the refugees return, there will be a Palestinian majority in this country. And yet, the two-state solution, as you can see, gives Israel 78% of the country, and all the occupied territories. All the territory claimed by the Palestinians for a state represent only 22% of historic Palestine. So we've heard about Ehud Barak's generous offer at Camp David. It's thrown up all the time. A generous offer he made, and Arafat refused and did the Intifada, and therefore we're off the hook. We tried peace, the Arabs rejected it, and so all that stuff, which is an urban myth. There never was a generous offer at Camp David. But we never hear about Arafat's generous offer, which was probably too generous. And that is, the two-state solution was accepted by the United States. It's been accepted by the United Nations. It's accepted, it's the plan all these years of what's called the Quartet, which is the United States, Europe, Russia, and the UN. It shows you where the rest of the world is. In 1988, the PLO, under Arafat, formally and publicly accepted the two-state solution. Now, this was a generous offer or a gesture on the part of a colonized people that's probably unprecedented. In other words, here's a people who feel colonized. I mean, they were living in their country peacefully. They weren't at war with anybody all these centuries. Farmers, living in cities, they had businesses and so on. And all of a sudden, people come in from Russia, from Poland, and say, this is our country now. We can't expect the native population to be Zionists. I mean, they were living there. It's their country, it's their land. They owned 98% of the land. They had their own history and identity. And all of a sudden, people come in and say, it's our country now, get out. So that the idea then, that in 1988, a colonized people gave up political claim to 78% of their country by accepting the two-state solution is something that's almost incomprehensible. Can you imagine the United States giving up Texas and Texas and California to Mexico? Texas I can see. Actually, maybe that's not stretching it. California? So that the Palestinians bent over more than backwards to accommodate the Israelis and the international community. And they said, even though we will be the majority in this country, we will make peace with you, Israel, for less than a quarter of the land. So why wasn't this resolved 26, 27 years ago? The international community agrees, the PLO agreed. In 2002, the Arab League unanimously adopted what was called the Saudi Peace Initiative, or the Arab Peace Initiative, saying that if Israel gives up the occupied territories, the Arab world will not only make peace with Israel, it will integrate it into the region. There was even talk of Israel joining the Arab League. So if Israel really wanted peace and security, which is what it's always telling us, why didn't it grab the two-state solution 26 years ago? I mean, we could have been 26 years into peace and development. These two peoples would have a tremendous economy, a tremendous impact on the region, and who knows how it would have affected Syria and Iraq and the whole issue of political Islam that takes a lot of its strength from the alienation and certainly from the suffering of the Palestinians. I mean, in Bin Laden's tapes, almost every one of his tapes, he mentions Palestine. So, in other words, everybody agreed on this solution with one exception: successive governments of Israel, who have said no. No. This entire country is ours. From the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, it's all ours, and not only are we Judaizing the country, which is the term we use, the other side of that coin being de-Arabizing the country, but we can win. In other words, until today, Israel has a win-lose equation of mind. Why should we compromise if we can win? Why would you accept 78%? 78% is a pretty good achievement. What do you want, more than 78%? Well, if you could have 100%, why compromise on 78? And so all these years then, even though Israel frames the conflict as one in which Israel is the victim, and that's a very powerful place to be. If you can have power, and you can be the fourth largest nuclear power in the world, and you can be an occupying power for almost half a century, and a strategic ally of the world superpower, and yet you're the victim, you can't be held accountable because you can't hold In other words, I have power with no responsibility at all because I'm the victim. You can't hold the victim responsible. So that's been the dynamic, that Israel has claimed that it's the victim and everything it does is out of security. What I'm arguing is that that's simply not the case. That Israel is engaged in a proactive campaign of Judaizing and taking the whole of Palestine. What Jabotinsky, who's was a right-wing Zionist leader. He's like the godfather of Netanyahu. Netanyahu's father was Jabotinsky's secretary. And Lenny has written about this. Jabotinsky said that we have to turn Palestine into, well, he said it the other way. He said, we will win when the natives, which is what he called the Palestinians. Today, you would never call them the natives, because we're the natives. The Israeli Jews are the natives. I mean, but Jabotinsky was being a little naive and innocent in those days. In 1923, when he wrote this article, The Iron Wall, in which he says, we will win when the Arabs or the natives despair of the land of Israel ever becoming Palestine. So despair is a part of the Israeli policy all these years. And in fact, Israel's in a process of Judaizing the country. And it's not only a claim, but on the ground, Israel has imposed over the occupied territories what I call a matrix of control. In other words, you can have your claim and so on, but the point is you're in the world. There's negotiations, there's international pressures. Maybe you'll have a president that's putting pressure on you. And in fact, in the American political scene, and of course the United States is the only country Israel cares about. Traditionally, the Republicans have always been much more critical of Israel than the Democrats. In other words, there were times in which administrations, almost all Republican administrations, were very critical of Israel until the rise of the Christian right and Christian Zionism, and now the Republicans have fallen into line, and there's bipartisan support. But nevertheless, you know, you get Kerry, and here and there you get the EU pressing. So what Israel has done is create facts on the ground that prejudice any negotiations. In other words, Jabotinsky also wrote that we'll win when our presence is so massive and so permanent that it can never be moved. So that Israel has imposed this matrix that has really eliminated the two-state solution. In other words, I would argue, and I will argue tonight, the two-state solution is gone. It's over, it's finished. Or as Kerry said, poof. Poof. I don't know if you, that's like the quote of the century. It's a young century, it's only 14 years old. But still, Kerry was in Congress just about a month and a half ago, testifying in Congress. And he's saying, you know, we had this plan, we were sitting with both sides. In one of his visits, Kerry came with 130 advisors. And we're negotiating, we're talking, and as we're doing all this, Israel is building settlements and building settlements and building settlements. 5,000 housing units were approved in the 9 months in which these negotiations are going on. And Kerry said in Congress, I'm almost quoting, he says, you know, we're trying to do this, and Israel's building settlements, and one day, poof, poof, it was over. In other words, there was no way in which you could convince the Palestinians, and in fact anybody, that a Palestinian state could emerge from the Israeli settlement enterprise. Not only that, but Israel has done more. I won't get into too much detail, but Israel has fragmented the Palestinian territory. There, you know, the international community demanded, in the two-state solution idea, territorial contiguity, a contiguous, coherent territory with borders in which you could develop an economy and you would have genuine sovereignty. So one of the first things Israel did was to fragment the Palestinian territories. So today, 95% of the Palestinians in the West Bank live in what are called areas A and B. A being the darker brown areas around the big cities, and B being the lighter brown, kind of the beige area around as well. 38% of the occupied territories. East Jerusalem, of course, has been annexed. And I would argue that there is no more East Jerusalem. And this is key to the two-state solution, that East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. There is no more East Jerusalem. If you go, there's a couple islands where Arabs live, but there is no coherent urban entity with an urban economy and a coherency that you could call a city in any meaningful way. I would say that East Jerusalem is gone, and I would argue that there's no more West Bank either. That in fact, Israel has succeeded in turning the West Bank into Judea and Samaria. So not more space. In other words, Israel itself deliberately and consciously eliminated the two-state solution. And I think we should stop talking about the two-state solution. And that's what I try to keep telling my J Street friends. Let's stop talking, because if you talk about an irrelevant solution that is not going to be, you're simply muddying the waters. You're preventing us from getting on and really conceptualizing a solution that's just and will work. Then, of course, what Israel's done is it's forcibly expelled the Palestinians from Area C, where the settlements are. In other words, besides these settlement blocks, all these blue dots are settlements. There's more than 200 settlements, more than 500,000 Israelis living in the occupied territories. So that what Israel's done then is it's forced the Palestinians either out of the country, because Israel's trying to get rid of the middle classes. It knows you're not going to get rid of the masses of Palestinians. You're not going to, 4.5 million Palestinians aren't going to leave yet. But if we can get the middle classes out, by making life so difficult for them that there's no future for their children, there's no jobs, there's no economy, there's no housing, middle class people will leave, and they have the wherewithal to leave. In the last 15 years, about 400,000 Palestinians have left the occupied territories. And the vast, vast majority of those people are middle class, leaving the rest of the population rudderless, leaderless, and easy to control. And those are then shoved into areas A and B. So for example, in 1967, there were 250,000 Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley, mostly farmers. Today there are less than 50,000 left, and 30,000 live in Jericho. They've all been shoved into areas A and B, and that's where the house demolition issue comes in. Because Palestinians own land, they own Area C. They're farmers, and if you don't have money, Israel has also impoverished the Palestinians over the years. 70% of the Palestinians live below the poverty line. So the only thing I have as a Palestinian, the only resource I have, if my son wants to get married, is land. Land where next to my house where he can build a small home. So I lose my land because it's expropriated. Israel has declared 70% of the West Bank to be Israeli state land. It does not recognize the deeds of most Palestinians, and then it doesn't grant building permits. So here I want to shift for a couple minutes, if I can, to the story of a family. So we begin to understand exactly how this works. We'll go from the high politics to the nitty-gritty. Because like I said, it's creating these facts on the ground that allow Israel to win, rather than the big political principles. This is the Shawamri family. Salim, his wife Arabia, and at that time 6 kids. They had another child after that. Both refugees from Israel of 1948. They were born after, but their families were driven out of what became Israel. They're cousins, and they were married. Salim's part of the family went to the old city to live after 48, and then in the 60s they were moved to the Shuafat refugee camp, which is a refugee camp inside Jerusalem today. Arabia's part of the family went to Jordan, where she grew up. Salim became a construction engineer. He went through the UN vocational school, the UNRWA school system, in the refugee camp, married Arabia, and they went to Saudi Arabia, where for 10 years he worked as a construction engineer. Then the Oslo peace process began in 1993, and like thousands of other Palestinians, he wanted to come home to build a home and participate in the rebuilding of his country. They came back, and they bought a small plot of land near the Shuafat refugee camp in the town of Anata. Since we're at a church, for religiously oriented people, Anata is the hometown of the prophet Jeremiah. It's Anatot in the Bible. And in fact, next to Anata is a huge military base that's called Anatot. I'm not so sure Jeremiah would be ecstatic with what's happening in his hometown. They bought this plot of land, and they registered the plot of land with the Israeli government. In other words, it belongs to them. And then they applied for a building permit to the Israeli authorities. And they had to apply to the Israeli civil administration. So here's where language comes in. Israel calls its military government a civil administration, in order to give the impression of normal administration. Nothing is political, everything is proper, and certainly to lower the military profile. And 3 times he applied, each time costing him $5,000. So Israel makes the whole process of applying unaffordable to the vast majority of Palestinians. And each time he was turned down. Now, the overall way that Israel turns down Palestinians is by zoning. In other words, on the one hand, Israel presents itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. Obama will tell you we share the same moral values, Israel and the United States. Well, how do you square that with demolishing the homes of a population? Israel's demolished 30,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territory since 1967, in addition to tens of thousands more inside Israel. So what Israel's done then, rather than to use the army, so it has this appearance of democracy and proper administration, is it zoned almost the whole West Bank as agricultural land. You see? So when a Palestinian like Salim comes and applies for a building permit, the answer is, sorry, this is agricultural land. So you say, well, okay, but wait a minute. What about the 200 settlements on the same land? What about the 500,000 Israelis? Well, simple. Israelis, we, sit on the planning commissions. So to rezone from agriculture to residential takes a second if you want to do it. It's all legal. It's Kafkaesque, but it's all legal, you see? So that Salim and Arabia will refuse. And so, like thousands of other Palestinian families, they ended up having to build a small home for themselves. They have to live somewhere without a building permit. I mean, it's a catch-22. If you apply for a permit and don't get it, and you build, you're a criminal, or you're an offender, right? You should be demolished. You applied and were turned down. Now, it's like a lottery. There's 2.5 million Palestinians living in the West Bank. Last year, Israel granted 18 building permits to 2.5 million people. So if they didn't grant any building permits, nobody would play the game. But it's like a lottery. I mean, you have a lottery in Connecticut. I have bad news for you, you're not going to win. But you buy tickets anyway, right? It's the same thing here. You know you're not going to get a permit, but you don't want to be demolished. You say, look, I'm a good guy, I never did anything political, I know some Israelis, maybe I have a lawyer. And you try to build a case for yourself. So finally, without a permit, he built anyway. And of course, if you don't apply for a permit and you build, then you're certainly a criminal. So this is the epitome of a Kafkaesque situation. Now, it's also a cold calculation. The families say, look, there are tens of thousands of houses with demolition orders. In East Jerusalem alone, there are 20,000 demolition orders outstanding. In the West Bank, tens of thousands, well, we don't know how many. So you say, you know, there's so many houses to demolish, I'll build. And maybe they won't come for a year. And over that year, maybe there'll be a peace process, something will happen. Maybe they won't come for 5 years. Maybe I'll win the lottery and they'll never come. So you build. And in fact, Salim and Arabia lived in their home for 5 years. Until one day in July 1998, they're having lunch, and there's a knock on the door. And these are the officials of the civil administration. This is Rami, and this is Micha, accompanied by about 150 Israeli soldiers, actually. Salim answers the door. Rami says to him, is this your house? Salim says, yes, it's my house. He says, no, it isn't. It's our house now. You have 15 minutes to get your belongings out. We're going to demolish it.
Before we go, this photo of American Mohammad Soltan and his father. Soltan was in 2013 in Rabaa Square in Cairo at the peaceful sit-down protest of the Sisi coup. 1,000 people were shot to death at that time. Soltan was only injured, but was shortly arrested and has been in a prison ever since. Obama has done squat for this American citizen, and Kerry, as you know, is trying with all his might to restore full aid to the Sisi dictatorship. This photo is of a recent Sultan court appearance. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.